80 million gallons of pristine high desert water doesn't just evaporate. It takes heavy machinery, staggering entitlement, and a woman named Emma, who believes a homeowners association badge grants her dominion over the earth itself. My grandfather spent 40 years building an ecologically perfect, drought-proof reservoir on our family land. After his death, I left for 6 months to settle the estate. Returning, I found dead fish, cracked concrete, and a commercial-grade pipeline siphoning our legacy straight into a luxury subdivision sprinkler system. Dust coated the windshield of my truck in a thick, powdery film as I turned off the state highway onto the unpaved access road. It had been 8 months since I'd driven this route. 8 months since I buried my grandfather, Arthur, locked the heavy iron gates of his property, and flew back to the coast to untangle the bureaucratic nightmare of his estate. Grandpa Arthur wasn't a prepper, but he was a man who understood the fundamental truth of the American West. Water is blood. You have it, you live. You don't, you wither. Back in the late 70s, he bought 300 acres of cheap, sun-blasted scrubland, sitting in a natural, geographic bowl just outside the city limits. People called him a fool, but Arthur was a civil engineer. He spent the next 4 decades turning that bowl into a masterpiece of hydrology. He secured senior water rights, ironclad, grandfathered-in rights that predated the sprawling urban development now choking the valley. He lined a natural 50-acre depression with a specialized synthetic geomembrane, built heavily reinforced concrete retaining walls, and established a self-sustaining ecosystem with aeration pumps and deep water channels. At its peak, the reservoir held a reserve worth millions, acting as a private sanctuary and a leased resource for local agriculture during dry years. It was his life's work. Now it was mine. The drive up the winding dirt road felt heavier than usual. I had the deed in the glove box, finally cleared through probate. I was ready to come back, fix up the cabin, and figure out my next steps. I parked by the old cedar-sided cabin, grabbed my bags, and stopped. Something was wrong. The air was usually cooler here, humidified by the massive body of water sitting just over the ridge. You could usually hear the gentle, low hum of the commercial aeration pumps, keeping the water oxygenated. Today, the air was dead, baking hot, and carrying a sickly, sulfuric smell. I dropped my bags on the porch and sprinted up the dirt trail that led to the reservoir overlook. My boots slipped on loose gravel. My chest tightened with a sudden, irrational panic. When I crested the ridge, my stomach dropped into my shoes. The water was gone, not just low, not just suffering from a dry summer. The reservoir had been gutted. A 50-acre lake, 25 feet deep at the center, was reduced to a muddy, foul-smelling puddle in the deepest channel. The towering concrete retaining walls, designed to be supported by the outward pressure of millions of gallons of water, stood exposed and chalky white in the sun. Along the sloping banks, the specialized geomembrane liner, a thick, black, rubberized shield that kept the water from seeping into the porous desert earth, was visibly buckling. Without the water weight pressing it down, the clay underneath was drying, cracking, and causing the liner to tear away from its anchors. Thousands of fish lay rotting in the sun-baked mud. The smell was a physical wall, a suffocating wave of decay. I stood there for a full 10 minutes, entirely paralyzed. My brain refused to process the scale of the destruction. Evaporation doesn't do this. A leak doesn't do this. Not with the bedrock below. Water of this volume doesn't vanish without a trace. I scrambled down the embankment, my boots sinking into the crusty, foul-smelling shoreline. I followed the waterline, looking for a breach in the retaining walls. There was nothing. I walked toward the primary pump house, a concrete bunker on the southern edge. The door was locked, undisturbed. Then I heard it. A faint, high-pitched mechanical whine coming from the far western perimeter, the property line that bordered the brand-new, hyper-wealthy subdivision known as Emerald Ridge. Emerald Ridge had been built over the last 5 years, a sprawling tumor of McMansions dropped right into the middle of the desert. They were infamous locally because they insisted on maintaining Kentucky bluegrass lawns in a Stage 3 drought zone. I walked the perimeter fence, pushing through dry mesquite and sagebrush. As I got closer to the property line, the ground grew softer. Mud clung to my boots. There, cutting directly under my chain-link boundary fence, was a trench. It was 3 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and roughly backfilled with loose dirt. A heavy-duty, 8-inch PVC pipe protruded from the dirt on my side, snaking down the bank directly into the remaining puddle of the reservoir. Attached to the end was a massive commercial-grade submersible intake pump. Thick, black electrical cables ran alongside the pipe, disappearing back under the fence toward the manicured green lawns of Emerald Ridge. The pump was whining, sucking up mud and the last dregs of water, trying to feed a beast that had already consumed a lifetime of my grandfather's work. They had trenched under my fence, trespassed onto my land, dropped a high-capacity pump into my private reservoir, and siphoned it dry. A cold, absolute rage settled over me. It wasn't a fiery, screaming anger. It was a heavy, mechanical certainty. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I turned around, walked back to my truck, and grabbed my toolbox. I walked back down the ridge carrying a heavy steel sledgehammer and a pair of bowl cutters. The afternoon sun beat down on my neck, but I barely felt it. I was hyper-focused on the black electrical cable snaking through the dirt. When I reached the trench, I didn't hesitate. I swung the sledgehammer down onto the exposed 8-inch PVC pipe with everything I had. The plastic shattered with a loud, satisfying crack, sending a spray of foul, muddy water into the air. I brought the hammer down again and again until the pipe was utterly crushed, severing the flow. The submersible pump whined in protest, dry heaving in the mud. I took the bolt cutters, snipped the thick black electrical cables, and watched the pump finally die. Silence returned to the canyon, save for the buzzing of flies over the dead fish. I climbed up to the property line, grabbed the severed end of the pipe leading into Emerald Ridge, and dragged it back onto my property. I wasn't going to leave a single piece of their equipment on my side of the fence. I didn't have to wait long. Less than 20 minutes later, a white, lifted golf cart came tearing down the paved utility path on the Emerald Ridge side of the fence. It ground to a halt, kicking up dust. Out stepped a woman in her late 50s. She wore a pristine white tennis visor, a matching polo shirt, and khaki capris. A thick silver lanyard hung around her neck, displaying a plastic ID badge with the Emerald Ridge logo. Her face was tight, her eyes hidden behind oversized designer sunglasses. Behind her sat a man in a maintenance uniform, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Hey!" she shrieked, her voice cutting through the dry air like a circular saw. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" I walked up to the chain-link fence, the sledgehammer resting casually on my shoulder. "I'm stopping a theft. Who are you?" "I am Emma Smith," she said, practically inflating her chest, "president of the Emerald Ridge Homeowners Association, and you just destroyed community property." I stared at her. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it physically stunned me. "Community property? You trenched under my fence and dropped a pump into my private reservoir." Emma scoffed, waving a manicured hand dismissively at the ruined mud pit behind me. "Oh, please, don't be dramatic. That water was just sitting there, turning stagnant and breeding mosquitoes. It's an eyesore and a health hazard to our neighborhood. We have an active community that requires irrigation. You've been abandoning this property for months." "My grandfather died," I said, keeping my voice dangerously flat. "And even if I left it for 10 years, it's my property. It's my water." "Actually," Emma said, stepping closer to the fence, her lips curling into a smug, condescending smile. "Under our community bylaws, the HOA retains the right to manage adjacent environmental hazards to protect property values. Furthermore, since your little pond sits over a shared aquifer, we have riparian rights to access it for the betterment of the community. We're in a drought, if you haven't noticed. Emerald Ridge has a standard to maintain." I actually laughed. It was a dark, humorless sound. "A shared aquifer? You pumped out a sealed geomembrane-lined surface reservoir, you absolute lunatic." You didn't tap an aquifer. You siphoned a tank. You stole 80 million gallons of private property. Her smug smile vanished, replaced by a mask of furious indignation. I will not be spoken to this way by some vagrant. You are going to pay for that pipe, and you are going to allow my maintenance team back over there to re-establish the connection. The community council voted on this. The community council of a subdivision has zero legal authority over unincorporated private land, I said. Get off my fence line before I call the sheriff. Call them, Emma yelled. Call them. We'll see who they listen to. The HOA pays half the property taxes in this county. I pulled out my phone and dialed dispatch. 2 hours later, a county sheriff's cruiser finally rolled up the dirt road. Officer Davis, a heavy-set guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, trudged up the hill. Emma had already called him herself and was standing at the fence line, waving a manila folder frantically. I explained exactly what happened. I showed Davis the property lines. I showed him the shattered pipe, the destroyed reservoir, and the dead fish. Davis took off his hat, wiped his sweating forehead, and sighed. He walked over to the fence to talk to Emma. I couldn't hear the whole conversation, but I heard her repeatedly saying the words easement by necessity, nuisance mitigation, and community property values. She shoved a piece of paper through the chain link, some official-looking HOA document with a gold seal. Davis walked back to me, looking entirely defeated. Mr. Miller, Davis said, I see what you're saying, but Mrs. Smith here has documentation claiming an emergency easement granted by her board due to fire hazard and drought mitigation. Now, I don't know if that piece of paper is worth the ink on it, but I ain't a judge. She trenched under my fence and stole millions of dollars of water, I said, my voice rising for the first time. It's grand larceny. It's vandalism. Look at the lake. Look, son, Davis said, holding up a placating hand. It's a property line dispute over water rights. That's a civil matter. I can't arrest the president of an HOA for managing water infrastructure, not without a court order saying her paperwork is bogus. I'll write up a report documenting the damage, but you're going to have to take this to court. Emma smiled at me through the fence. It was a cold, triumphant smirk. Have a nice day, Mr. Miller. Expect a bill for the plumbing repairs. Davis drove away. I stood alone on the ridge, looking at the rotting husk of my grandfather's legacy, realizing that being right didn't matter. The law wasn't going to swoop in and save me. Emma had weaponized the sheer boring bureaucracy of civil disputes to commit a massive crime, betting that a lone, grieving grandson wouldn't have the funds or the energy to fight a wealthy HOA. She made a catastrophic miscalculation. The next morning, I drove into the city and walked into the offices of Jenkins and Vance, though I only cared to see Sarah Jenkins. She was a water rights attorney who had represented my grandfather 15 years ago when the county tried to rezone our access road. She was ruthless, brilliant, and charged $600 an hour. I sat in her leather chair and dropped the photos of the reservoir onto her desk. Sarah, a sharp-featured woman with steel-gray hair, picked up the photos. Her eyes narrowed behind her reading glasses. For a long time, the only sound in the office was the ticking of her wall clock. Arthur spent 40 years building that, she whispered, a trace of genuine horror in her voice. She looked up at me. Who did this? Emerald Ridge HOA, I said. Emma Smith. Sarah sighed, leaning back and rubbing her temples. Emma, of course. She's been terrorizing the zoning board for 3 years. She thinks Emerald Ridge is a sovereign nation. Did you call the police? Civil matter, I scoffed, repeating the sheriff's words. Technically true, until we prove malice and quantify the damages, Sarah said, her tone shifting from sympathetic to strictly business. David, I need you to understand something. Water theft is bad, but the water itself is only a fraction of what you've lost here. A reservoir of that size isn't a bathtub. It's a pressurized structural system. She picked up her phone. I'm calling Dr. Aris. He's the best forensic hydrologist in the state. We need him on that property yesterday. Do not touch anything else. Do not engage with Emma. Let them hang themselves. Dr. Aris arrived 2 days later with a team of 3 assistants, a drone, and a truck full of surveying equipment. For a week, my property looked like a crime scene. They took soil samples, measured the deflection of the concrete retaining walls, and ran ground-penetrating radar over the dry lake bed. When Sarah called me back into her office 10 days later, Dr. Aris was sitting there, looking grim. "It's worse than we thought," Dr. Aris said, sliding a thick binder across the desk. "When they pumped the water out that fast, they depressurized the basin. The concrete retaining walls on the north side were built to withstand outward pressure, but they rely on the static weight of the water to maintain equilibrium with the soil behind them. When the water dropped precipitously, the soil pressure pushed back. The walls have microfractures. They are structurally compromised." He flipped to a photo of the cracked black plastic along the banks. "Furthermore, the HDPE geomembrane liner requires temperature regulation and weight. Exposed to the UV index and the heat without water, it shrank and cracked. The entire 50-acre liner is ruined. It cannot be patched. It must be ripped out and replaced." "Bottom line?" I asked, my chest feeling tight. Sarah handed me a summary sheet. "D. Replacement of 80 million gallons of water at commercial trucking rates, $1.2 million. Demolition and recasting of compromised concrete retaining walls, $2.4 million. Removal and replacement of 50 acres of 60 mil HDPE geomembrane liner, $3.1 million. Ecological remediation, soil treating, restocking, flora replacement, $800,000. Engineering, labor, and permitting, $500,000. Total estimated damages," Sarah said quietly, $8 million, give or take. I stared at the number. $8 million. Emma Smith hadn't just stolen water. She had detonated a bomb in the middle of my grandfather's life's work. "They don't have $8 million, I said numbly. "The HOA doesn't have that." "No," Sarah said, a cold smile touching her lips. "Well, they don't. But their master insurance policy has a $10 million umbrella limit for environmental negligence, and the homeowners of Emerald Ridge are all individually liable for special assessments if the HOA is sued into bankruptcy. We aren't just going to sue them, David. We are going to unmake them." But Emma wasn't waiting around to be sued. Her entitlement knew no bounds. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, there was a certified letter taped to my front door. Emerald Ridge, HOA. Official notice of violation and fine. I ripped it open. It was a formal invoice. Emma had actually fined me. She cited a county ordinance regarding attractive nuisances and blight. Because the reservoir was now empty and smelled of dead fish, she claimed my property was lowering Emerald Ridge's home values. The fine was $500 a day until I remedied the biohazard. Attached to the fine was an invoice for $4,200 for destruction of community utility infrastructure, the pipe I smashed. At the bottom of the letter, in bold font, was a final threat. If the property owner fails to comply, the HOA reserves the right to contract third-party remediation services to abate the nuisance at the owner's expense. She was going to try it again. I didn't call Sarah. I didn't call the police. I drove to the hardware store and bought 6 high-definition, motion-activated trail cameras with infrared night vision. I spent the evening hiking the perimeter of my property, mounting the cameras high in the mesquite trees, angling them perfectly to cover the fence line, the trench, and the access road. That night, I moved my mattress from the bedroom to the living room of the cabin. I opened the window facing the reservoir. I loaded my grandfather's 12-gauge shotgun with rock salt and laid it across the table. I made a pot of black coffee, and I sat in the dark. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, the quiet hum of a diesel engine echoed down the canyon. Through the window, under the pale moonlight, I saw the headlights of a mini excavator rolling up to my fence line. Emma hadn't just sent a maintenance guy this time. She had hired contractors. She was going to redig the trench, lay a new pipe, and try to tap into whatever groundwater she thought was left beneath the mud. I watched the yellow machine tear into the earth, entirely on my side of the property line. The red lights on my trail cameras blinked silently in the dark. capturing every second of the felony trespassing and property destruction in crystal clear 4K resolution. I took a sip of my coffee, let them dig for about 20 minutes to ensure the crime was fully committed, and then I picked up my phone to call Sarah. The trap was set. I didn't grab the shotgun. The 12-gauge sitting on my kitchen table was for personal defense, not for protecting dirt. You don't win a war by shooting the foot soldiers. You win by securing the intelligence and cutting off the supply lines. My time overseas had taught me that much. Panic is loud. True leverage is silent. I stood by the window in the dark, sipping my coffee, watching the yellow mini excavator tear a jagged wound into the western edge of my property. The operator was clumsy. He was fighting the loose gravel and the steep incline of the retaining wall basin. His bucket scraped against the exposed, micro-fractured concrete of the reservoir's northern wall, sending a shower of sparks into the dry night air. Every time that steel bucket struck the concrete, he was adding another $100,000 to Emma Smith's tab. I let him dig for 45 minutes. I needed unquestionable, undeniable proof of extensive, premeditated excavation. The 6 trail cameras mounted in the mesquite trees were silently eating up gigabytes of 4K night vision footage. When the operator finally killed the engine to step out and take a leak against one of my grandfather's ancient cedar posts, I picked up my cell phone. I didn't call the local county dispatch this time. Sheriff Davis had made his position clear. I called the state police barracks 2 towns over. I have an active, unauthorized excavation occurring on my private property, I told the dispatcher, keeping my voice entirely flat. Unmarked heavy machinery. The operator has breached a structurally compromised dam retaining wall. I am armed, and I am currently observing him from my residence. I need state troopers out here before this escalates. Mentioning the compromised dam and the heavy machinery did the trick. Mentioning I was armed pushed it to priority 1. 20 minutes later, the canyon walls lit up with strobing red and blue lights. 3 state trooper SUVs came tearing down the access road, bypassing the Emerald Ridge gates entirely and pulling directly onto my land. I walked out the front door, leaving the shotgun inside. I kept my hands visible. The troopers swarmed the mini excavator. The operator, a kid who couldn't have been older than 22, was zip-tied and sitting in the dirt before he could even zip his pants. I walked down the ridge to meet the lead trooper, a tall, hard-eyed man named Miller. "Your property?" Trooper Miller asked, shining a heavy mag light into the fresh, gaping trench. "Yes," I said. I handed him my deed, a copy of the property lines, and my grandfather's death certificate. "He crossed the fence line an hour ago. He's striking the concrete supports of the reservoir." Miller walked over to the kid sitting in the dirt. "Who do you work for, son?" The kid was terrified. He was shaking, dirt clinging to his sweat-soaked OO shirt. "I just do independent contracting, mostly landscaping. The lady hired me under the table. She said it was an emergency utility repair. She said she owned the easement." "What lady?" Miller asked. "Mrs. Smith, from the big houses over there. She gave me $2,000 in cash to dig a line to the water basin tonight because nobody would be around." I looked at Miller. He looked at me. "Did she give you a work order?" Miller asked. The kid nodded frantically. "In the cab, on the dashboard." She signed it. Miller retrieved a piece of heavy cardstock from the excavator. He shined his light on it. It was an Emerald Ridge HOA letterhead, authorizing overnight emergency excavation, signed with a flourishing, arrogant signature. Emma Smith, President. Well," Miller said, his voice dry as the desert air. "That's felony destruction of private property, felony trespassing and operating heavy machinery without a commercial permit." He looked down at the kid. "You're going to jail tonight, son, but if you tell the judge exactly what you just told me, you might avoid a state penitentiary." By 8 a.m. the next morning, I was sitting in Sarah Jenkins' office. I dropped the thumb drive containing the trail cam footage and a copy of the state police report onto her desk. Sarah plugged the drive into her laptop. She watched the footage of the excavator tearing into the concrete. She didn't say a word. She just smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory smile. Sheriff Davis wouldn't arrest her because it was a civil dispute over water, Sarah said, typing furiously on her keyboard. But hiring an unlicensed contractor to breach a structural retaining wall in the middle of the night, that crosses the criminal threshold. The state police will likely refer charges to the district attorney, but we aren't waiting for the DA. We are dropping the hammer today. By noon, Sarah had filed a massive civil lawsuit in the county's superior court. She didn't just sue the Emerald Ridge HOA. She named Emma Smith individually, citing gross negligence, intentional tort, and malicious destruction of property. But the real weapon was the temporary restraining order. At 4 p.m., a process server walked past the security gates of Emerald Ridge. Emma was hosting a drought awareness committee meeting on her immaculate, perfectly green back patio. The server handed her a thick manila envelope. The injunction was absolute. It ordered the Emerald Ridge HOA to immediately cease all irrigation, water usage for landscaping, and pool maintenance. It legally froze their operating accounts pending a hearing on the damages to my property. They couldn't spend a dime, and they couldn't water a single blade of grass. Emma Smith was finally grounded, and the meter on her financial ruin had just started ticking. The legal system doesn't move at the speed of vengeance. It moves at the speed of paper. But when the paper carries an $8 million weight, it has a way of crushing the oxygen out of a room. For 3 weeks, Emerald Ridge baked under the July sun. The injunction held. Without their daily sprinklings, the Kentucky bluegrass lawns turned a sickly, brittle yellow. The manicured hedges browned and died. The neighborhood began to look exactly like the desert they had tried so hard to conquer. Emma's initial reaction was aggressive denial. She sent out a neighborhood-wide email claiming a frivolous lawsuit by a disgruntled local was temporarily hindering operations, but that the HOA legal team would have it dismissed in days. She was wrong. The deposition took place in a sterile, glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown high-rise. The air conditioning was freezing. I sat quietly at the end of the long mahogany table, wearing a dark suit. I didn't fidget. I just watched. Emma walked in, wearing a tailored white pantsuit, projecting an aura of bored inconvenience. She was flanked by her attorney, a slick, over-caffeinated guy named Gregson, who looked like he spent more time on golf courses than in courtrooms. Sarah Jenkins sat across from them. She had 3 massive binders stacked neatly in front of her. After the swearing in and the standard preliminaries, Sarah opened the first binder. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke with the methodical, detached precision of a surgeon operating on a terminal patient. "Mrs. Smith," Sarah began, sliding a photograph across the table. It was a high-resolution drone shot of the destroyed reservoir, the cracked retaining walls, and the rotting fish. "Do you recognize this property?" Emma barely glanced at it. "It's the blight adjacent to our community." "Yes." "Are you aware that this blight was a federally permitted, custom-engineered hydraulic reservoir containing 80 million gallons of water?" "It was a stagnant pond," Emma snapped, adjusting her cuffs. "It was breeding mosquitoes. We mitigated a nuisance. My board has the authority to protect our property values." Sarah slowly pulled out a document. "Let's talk about your board. You claim the HOA authorized the trenching and the installation of the high-capacity submersible pump on May 12th. Is that correct?" "Yes," Emma said. "Mrs. Smith, we subpoenaed the meeting minutes for the Emerald Ridge HOA board from January through June. There is no record of a vote regarding the Miller property. There is no record of an emergency easement discussion. There is, however, a work order signed exclusively by you." Sarah slid the state police evidence photo of the work order across the table. Gregson, Emma's lawyer, leaned forward, his brow furrowing. He looked at the document. He hadn't seen it. Emma had lied to her own counsel. "I have executive privilege in emergency situations," Emma said, her voice rising slightly. "We needed water for the community landscaping. We were facing a drought surcharge from the county. So, to avoid a county drought surcharge, you authorized the theft of private water?" Sarah asked. Objection, Gregson barked, argumentative. I'll rephrase, Sarah said calmly. Did you consult a structural engineer or a hydrologist before rapidly draining 25 feet of water from a reinforced concrete basin? No, it's a dirt hole, Emma sneered. You don't need an engineer to drain a puddle. Sarah opened the second binder. She extracted Dr. Aris's forensic hydrology report. According to the foremost forensic hydrologist in the state, the rapid depressurization caused by your pump compromised the static equilibrium of the concrete retaining walls. They are now microfractured and structurally condemned. Furthermore, exposing the 60 mil HDPE geomembrane liner to the sun destroyed it entirely. The basin is a total loss. Sarah pushed a single sheet of paper toward Gregson. Counsel, these are the itemized damages. Hard costs for demolition, material replacement, engineering and water replenishment at commercial trucking rates. The total physical damage is $8.1 million. Gregson stared at the paper. The blood physically drained from his face. He looked at the numbers, then looked at Emma, his mouth slightly open. That is absurd, Emma scoffed, waving her hand. You can't prove those cracks weren't there before, and even if you could, that's what the HOA master insurance policy is for. We have a $10 million umbrella. Let them pay this extortion. Sarah leaned back in her chair and smiled. It was the moment she had been waiting for. About your insurance, Mrs. Smith, Sarah said softly. We contacted your carrier, Pacific Indemnity, to file the preliminary claim. They formally denied it yesterday. Emma froze. They can't do that. They can, and they did, Sarah said, pulling out a letter from the insurance company. Your policy covers accidental property damage and negligence. Section 4, paragraph B explicitly excludes coverage for damages resulting from intentional illegal acts, willful trespass, and criminal vandalism. By hiring an unlicensed contractor in the middle of the night to breach a fence and destroy a retaining wall, you committed a crime. The state police have referred the matter to the DA. Pacific Indemnity has voided your coverage regarding this incident. Unfortunately, the silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. You don't have an umbrella, Emma, Sarah continued, dropping the formalities. You are completely exposed. We are amending our complaint tomorrow to include punitive damages, bringing the total suit to $12 million. Gregson slammed his pen down on the table. He was sweating now. You can't squeeze blood from a stone, Sarah. The HOA operating accounts hold maybe $300,000. You bankrupt the HOA, you get nothing. Oh, Gregson, you know better than that. Sarah laughed, a cold, dry sound. Emerald Ridge is a common interest development. Under state law, if the HOA entity cannot satisfy a legal judgment, the liability passes directly to the homeowners via a mandatory special assessment. All 100 homes in Emerald Ridge. Sarah looked directly into Emma's eyes. The arrogance was finally gone, replaced by a wide, staring terror. $12 million divided by 100 homes, Sarah said, enunciating every syllable. You are going to have to levy a special assessment of $120,000 against every single family in your neighborhood. Payable immediately, or we place a lien on every single house. Emma's mouth moved, but no sound came out. She looked at Gregson for help, but her lawyer was staring at the table, calculating his own malpractice exposure for taking this case blindly. We are done here, Sarah said, closing her binders. See you in court. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out. I hadn't said a single word, but I had watched a tyrant realize that her kingdom was built on sand, and the tide had just rushed in. You can mess with a person's commute. You can mess with their landscaping. But when you threaten the equity of a suburban homeowner, you create an enemy that knows no bounds. The news didn't stay quiet. It couldn't. Within 48 hours of the deposition, Sarah Jenkins legally compelled the Emerald Ridge HOA board to disclose the pending $12 million litigation and the voided insurance policy to the residents. The mandatory disclosure letters arrived in 100 mailboxes on a Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday morning, Emerald Ridge was a war zone. I didn't have to guess what was happening. The chaos spilled out onto the local community Facebook pages and the Nextdoor app. Screenshots of the HOA letter were posted everywhere. People who had spent $800,000 on their dream homes were waking up to find a $120,000 legal anvil hanging over their heads. Realtors who had pending sales in the neighborhood watched their deals vaporize overnight. You cannot secure a mortgage on a property with a pending six-figure liability lien. Emerald Ridge was paralyzed. The manicured facade of the community shattered completely. The dying yellow lawns became a physical manifestation of their financial ruin. Neighbors who used to wave at each other while walking their golden retrievers were now screaming at each other in the streets. They demanded an emergency town hall meeting. It was held on a Thursday evening at the local high school gymnasium because the Emerald Ridge clubhouse was too small to hold the fury of 300 terrified residents. I went. I didn't wear a suit this time. I wore a plain gray t-shirt, jeans, and my boots. I walked in quietly and stood in the very back, leaning against the folded bleachers. The air in the gymnasium was thick with sweat and hostility. The acoustic echo of the room amplified the angry murmurs into a dull, terrifying roar. Emma Smith sat at a folding table at the front of the room. She looked 10 years older. The crisp, white outfits were gone. She wore a dark, shapeless blouse. Her makeup couldn't hide the dark, exhausted circles under her eyes. Flanking her were two newly hired, incredibly nervous attorneys. The rest of her board members hadn't shown up. They had all resigned the day the letters went out. A man in his 40s, his face purple with rage, was standing at the microphone in the center aisle. "I want an answer right now," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Emma. My buyer backed out this morning. My house is worthless. Did you or did you not authorize digging a trench onto that man's land?" Emma leaned into the microphone. Her voice was small, defensive. "We were acting in the best interest of the community. The drought." "To hell with the drought," a woman yelled from the front row. "You stole water, you committed a felony, and now you expect us to pay $120,000 each to keep you out of jail." "The insurance company's acting in bad faith," Emma pleaded, trying to sound authoritative but failing miserably. "We are appealing their decision to drop our coverage. We will fight this lawsuit. We have a counterclaim for blight." "A counterclaim?" The man at the microphone interrupted, his voice cracking. "I talked to a real estate lawyer today, Emma. He laughed at me. He said we are dead to rights. He said the guy whose lake you destroyed has video of your contractor smashing his retaining wall. Is that true?" Emma hesitated. She looked down at her hands. The silence in the gymnasium stretched tight, like a wire about to snap. "Is it true, Emma?" the man demanded. "I was trying to keep our lawns green," Emma whispered into the mic. The gymnasium exploded. It was absolute pandemonium. People surged toward the front table. The two lawyers practically jumped out of their chairs, backing away toward the emergency exit. Residents were screaming, throwing crumpled HOA notices at the table. "Resign! You're paying my mortgage. We're suing you personally." I watched from the back of the room. My heart didn't race. I didn't feel a sense of triumphant joy. I just felt a quiet, heavy settling in my chest. Grandpa Arthur had spent 40 years building something out of nothing. He had wrestled life out of the dust through sheer will, patience, and engineering. Emma Smith had destroyed it in a single night out of sheer entitlement. She thought the world was a gated community, and she held the only key. She didn't understand that outside her walls, actions had physical, catastrophic consequences. I turned away from the screaming mob and pushed open the heavy double doors of the gymnasium. I walked out into the cool evening air. The fight wasn't completely over. There would be months of court dates, bankruptcy filings, and grueling settlement negotiations. I knew the reality of it. I would likely end up taking ownership of the Emerald Ridge Community Center, their parks, and a percentage of every home sold in that neighborhood for the next 20 years just to pay for the reconstruction of the reservoir. I climbed into my truck, turned the key, and drove back toward the canyon. When I reached the property line, I stopped the truck and walked out to the ridge overlooking the dry basin. The moon was high, casting long, stark shadows over the cracked concrete and the ruined black liner. It looked like a graveyard. But as I stood there in the quiet dark, I realized something. The liner was destroyed. The concrete was fractured, but the geography remained. The natural bowl was still there. The deep, heavy bedrock that held the water wasn't going anywhere. They had broken the vessel, but they couldn't take the land. I took a deep breath of the dry desert air. It would take years. It would take millions of dollars of their money. But I was going to tear out every piece of broken concrete. I was going to strip the ruined liner. I was going to rebuild the walls thicker, higher, and stronger. And when the winter rains finally came, washing down from the high peaks, the reservoir would fill again. I looked over at the dark, silent houses of Emerald Ridge, sitting on the other side of the fence. Their lawns were already dead. Their empire was crumbling. I smiled, turned my back on them, and walked home. The legal system is a meat grinder. It doesn't operate on vengeance or sudden dramatic justice. It operates on paperwork, endless delays, and the cold, unfeeling math of liability. For the residents of Emerald Ridge, that math was a death sentence. The special assessment hit in late September. A formal demand letter for $120,000 landed in every single mailbox. There was no payment plan. There was no grace period. The HOA was legally obligated to satisfy the court-ordered settlement, and the bylaws they had all signed when they bought their dream homes locked them into the shared debt. The neighborhood didn't just fracture, it shattered. Within 60 days, 25 families simply walked away, handing their keys back to the bank in voluntary foreclosure. Real estate signs sprouted on the dying lawns like tombstones, but selling wasn't an escape. You can't sell a house with a six-figure lien attached to the title. The remaining residents were trapped in a depreciating asset, bleeding cash to pay attorneys who told them exactly what Sarah Jenkins had told them on day one. They were going to lose. Emma Smith tried to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection. She thought she could wash her hands of the disaster and walk away with her personal assets intact. Sarah blocked it. She filed an adversarial proceeding in federal bankruptcy court, citing the state police report and the judge's ruling of willful and malicious destruction of property. Debts incurred through malicious criminal acts are non-dischargeable. Emma was forced to liquidate. I sat in my truck across the street on a Tuesday morning and watched a moving company box up her pristine white McMansion. The house went up for public auction to satisfy her portion of the legal fees and the initial damages. She lost her equity, her credit, and her kingdom. The last I heard, she moved to a rented apartment 2 states away, entirely ostracized by the people she once ruled. I never saw her again. She became a ghost, erased by the very bureaucracy she used to wield like a weapon. By November, the settlement funds finally cleared. $9.5 million. It was enough. I didn't hire a massive corporate engineering firm to fix the reservoir. I hired the local guys. I hired the sons and nephews of the men who had helped Grandpa Arthur pour the original concrete 40 years ago. The silence of the canyon was replaced by the deep, rhythmic thrum of heavy diesel engines. A fleet of excavators and dump trucks rolled past the rusted, padlocked gates of Emerald Ridge and onto my dirt access road. Tearing out 50 acres of ruined high-density polyethylene liner is brutal, ugly work. It required heavy machinery to rip the sun-baked, brittle plastic from the earth, loading it into specialized dumpsters to be hauled away. For 3 weeks, the smell of hot dust and old rubber hung heavy in the valley. Then came the concrete demolition. Jackhammers echoed off the canyon walls from dawn until dusk. We didn't just patch the micro-fractures. We tore the entire northern retaining wall down to the bedrock. We drilled new foundational anchors deep into the granite. When the pump trucks arrived, we poured walls that were 2 feet thicker than the originals, laced with a heavy grid of industrial rebar. I worked right alongside the crews. I drove the skid steers. I carried the rebar. I came back to the cabin every night with my hands blistered and my lungs coated in cement dust. I slept deeper and heavier than I had in a decade. The grief that had been sitting in my chest since Arthur died began to sweat out of me, replaced by the tangible, physical weight of dirt and steel. In late January, the new liner was laid. A massive, seamless expanse of 80 mm synthetic rubber, heat welded at the seams by men in heavy leather gloves. It looked like a black ocean stretching across the desert floor. All that was left was the water. You can't buy 80 million gallons of water on a whim, even with millions in the bank. We contracted a fleet of commercial water haulers to prime the deep channels, but the vast majority of the reservoir relied on the natural watershed, the runoff from the high desert peaks that Arthur had originally mapped out in the 70s. We had to wait for the sky. The drought broke in the second week of February. It started as a low, bruised purple line on the western horizon. The barometric pressure plummeted, making my ears pop. By nightfall, the wind was howling through the mesquite trees, carrying the sharp, metallic smell of ozone and wet sagebrush. Then, the sky tore open. It wasn't a gentle drizzle. It was an atmospheric river, a violent, sustained deluge that hammered the tin roof of the cabin so loudly I couldn't hear myself think. I put on a heavy waxed canvas jacket, grabbed a high-powered flashlight, and walked out into the storm. The mud sucked at my boots as I climbed the ridge. The rain lashed at my face, blinding and cold. When I reached the overlook, I pointed the beam of the flashlight down into the basin. The dry arroyos and drainage channels that fed the reservoir were roaring. Brown, churning water rushed down the slopes, hitting the black synthetic liner and swirling into the deep center trench. The sound was incredible. It was a deep, rushing roar of kinetic energy. The sound of a dead thing taking a breath. I stood on the newly poured concrete dam for hours, soaked to the bone, watching the water level rise. It covered the muddy bottom. It swallowed the intake pipes. It crept up the black sloped banks. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, crystalline stillness. I walked over to the primary pump house and through the heavy electrical breaker. Deep beneath the surface of the rising water, the massive commercial aeration pumps roared to life. A low, comforting hum vibrated through the concrete under my boots. Seconds later, a wide swath of bubbles erupted on the surface of the water, injecting oxygen back into the ecosystem. The reservoir was alive. I looked across the property line. Emerald Ridge sat in the gray morning light, looking like a ruin. The lawns were dead, brown patches of dirt. Several houses had boarded up windows. The pristine utility path where Emma used to drive her golf cart was cracked and overgrown with invasive weeds. They had tried to conquer the desert with paper and entitlement, and the desert had swallowed them whole. I walked back down the ridge to the cabin. I poured a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, listening to the hum of the pumps and the gentle lapping of water against the new concrete. Arthur was right. Water is blood. You have it, you live. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the keys to the property, and set them on the table. I wasn't going back to the coast. I wasn't going to sell. The estate was settled. The debt was paid. I was home. Sometimes the most satisfying justice doesn't come from a screaming match. It comes from a legally binding document and a very expensive invoice. Emma thought she could bully her way into a free water supply, but she ended up draining her own community dry. If you loved watching this entitled HOA president get exactly what she deserved, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this story with a friend, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply grounded stories of revenge and justice. Let me know in the comments, what's your worst HOA nightmare? See you next time.